Okay, just so you know, I don't very often use clickers, so you have to bear with me. This is a new experience for me. So, I don't know, does it not work? So, why does it take 100 years? Well, you can see from my slide that in the United States, we spend a lot of money on health care. Oh, twice as much as any other country in the world per person. Isn't that amazing? And you would think if we spend twice as much as any other country in the world, because we're a rich country, we would get fabulous outcomes. But we don't. In fact, the Commonwealth Fund found in 2010 that we come in last or next to last in quality, access, efficiency, equity, and health. So we spend a lot of money and we don't do too well. In fact, the details are pretty bad. We have fewer doctors. We go to the doctor less often. We have very bad child mortality, and we ourselves die more often than all the European countries. So we spend more money and we do more poorly in health on one hand, and we also spend more money on paperwork. $1,000 per person on just paperwork, compared, for instance, to Canada, which is very close to us, you know, geography. They only spend $300 per year. We spend $1,000 per year. Who thinks this is a good system? Okay, you're very smart. So you would say, okay, that's what's going on in the United States. Is anybody trying to change it? Well, in fact, for over 100 years, a number of Americans did think this was a bad idea, and we did try to change it. Because we can see that there are now, in 2008, 45 million Americans had no health care coverage. So bad, we spend a lot of money, no coverage, bad outcomes. We should change things. So let me show you about the 100 years of efforts. Theodore Roosevelt in 2012 tried to do it. Franklin Roosevelt, you've heard of, the New Deal. Harry Truman tried to change it. But who fought all these people? Can you guess who didn't want to change it? The doctors. The American Medical Association, because they said this was a communist plot. It's true. Lyndon Johnson, actually, in 1965, did get Medicare and Medicaid passed. Medicare covers people who are over 65, older people, and Medicaid, who are people who can't afford health care, mostly poor people. So in 1965, they fought the doctors, the American Medical Association, who still said this was a communist plot, and Lyndon Johnson won. Very unusual that we could beat the doctors, but at that time we won. Then my uncle, Senator Kennedy, worked with, can you believe it, 3 presidents, President Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter, all who wanted to have health care for all Americans, and tried to get it through for all Americans, and he lost. And just so you know, my uncle, Teddy Kennedy, really cared about health care. And why did he care? Because in 1964, he was in a small plane and it crashed. And so he was in a hospital for about 6 months. And he was laid back in a hospital. So he had a lot of time to think about how difficult it was if you were a normal person and you weren't Senator Kennedy and you weren't a Kennedy and you weren't rich, how difficult it was to live with not good health care. And then he had 3 children, and 2 of them had cancer. My cousin, Little Teddy, I call him Little Teddy, but he's bigger than me now. The day I got married, which was in 1973, my cousin, Teddy, had to get his leg amputated. So my uncle took me to the church, walked me down the aisle, and then he went to the hospital to have his son get his leg amputated. Very traumatic. But he understood that when you have cancer, he was lucky that he was a senator and he had access to the best medicine. But he talked to lots of other people who did not have that access. And then his daughter, Cara, also had cancer. And in fact, you remember Kiara. I was here at this conference about 5 years ago, and my cousin Cara died because of her cancer while I was here, and I had to leave the conference early to go to the funeral. So my uncle, because of his personal experience, fought very hard to get health care. But even with the President of the United States and the Senator, he couldn't get it passed. And then we had 3 presidents who didn't even care. Then we had Hillary Clinton. She tried to get it passed with her husband. They didn't succeed. So why did it lose? And I would argue there were 2 big reasons why it lost. 1, interest groups, which I'm going to go through, and 2, ideology. Now, what are the interest groups? Patients, doctors, hospitals, insurance, the pharmaceutical companies, and medical devices. Now, I have to say, I don't think there are very many Americans in this room. Are there any Americans aside from you? So, if there were Americans in this room, a lot of people would disagree with my presentation, just to be warned. So, I'm totally prejudiced in giving you this presentation. So, why didn't patients fight? Patients. Well, the reasons the patients didn't win is because there was really a patchwork of health care in the United States. First of all, after Medicare and Medicaid got passed, 1/3 of all Americans did have health care, and many Americans got health care through their businesses, through their employers, and through their unions. So only 15% of Americans didn't have health care, and so they weren't a large enough lobby. That was number 1. 2, doctors. Very interesting about doctors. Remember how I said the American Medical Association said that this was a communist plot? I just want to remember how much you remember what I said like 5 minutes ago. Well, after Medicare and Medicaid got passed, they suddenly realized that they had many more clients, and their fees went up, and so the health care and the doctors suddenly liked health care insurance. Interesting. So they switched. And after 1965, suddenly the doctors believed in health care insurance for all because they realized they could get more money and they got more patients. They switched. The hospitals didn't have as much power because they were getting money through their insurance companies and because lots of people felt sorry for hospitals, so they weren't a major fight. The insurance companies really fought hard against this because they thought if we have health care for all, they'll be out of business. The pharmaceuticals lobbied very hard against it, and they, in fact, spent a lot of money lobbying, $250 million. I'll get into that a little later. Oh, that slide is out of order. I'll get to that later, too. But just to give you a taste, Remember, you may have heard in the United States how we spend a lot of money on military. You know, the military-industrial complex, bombs, Air Force, tanks, nuclear bombs. You've heard of all of that? We spend 4 times as much money on healthcare lobbying than we do on the military-industrial state. 4 times. So there's a big fight against changing our healthcare system because of there's a big lobbying. You get that? And the medical devices and technology, they also didn't want to change anything because they were happy about how much money they were getting. So that's the interest groups in politics, at least in the United States. You may not have such interest groups in Italy. No capiche? I don't know. In the United States, money plays a big role. Second role in the United States is something called ideology, ideas. Remember the first night I talked about how Leonardo da Vinci thought that man was perfect? And everybody believed that men were perfect? Even though if they looked, they saw that men weren't perfect? So ideas sometimes blind you to the truth. And that's what's happened in the United States. So for 50 years, there was this whole idea that government actually could help people. It happened from like the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt until Ronald Reagan. There was this whole notion that government could help people. And the high point of this was during the 1960s under John Kennedy, and especially under Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. And at that time, we passed the civil rights laws, we passed consumer protection laws, and we passed the environmental protection laws. In fact, for the environment, we had something called Earth Day, and 20 million people came out and fought for Earth Day. And we got the many laws that said we're going to protect people. And that's the time we passed the healthcare laws. See, that came at that particular time in American history. But there were some Americans who were horrified at the idea that government could help people. And one of them was a guy called Lewis Powell, who eventually became a member of the Supreme Court. And in 1971, he wrote a memo. He was at that time a member of the Chamber of Commerce in Richmond, Virginia. And he wrote a memo which said that what is going on in the United States is terrible, and government is helping too many people, and it will fatally weaken or destroy the American free enterprise system. So he laid out this whole idea that government should not help people, and there was a fight between rugged individualism and that people believed people should work by themselves, capitalism that needed people to fight for themselves, and the idea that government was doing something called the nanny state. I should have slides to show you this, but I didn't. Next time, Kiara, I will have a slide of a nurse. And so when he did this, they started the Business Roundtable. They started something called the Heritage Foundation, then the Cato Foundation, and the American Enterprise Institute. So that really changed what happened in Washington. We went from 175 lobbying groups to 240. You can see the numbers. Do you see how many more lobbying happened? Business lobbyists then started to outnumber the members of Congress 130 to 1. Healthcare, as I said, spent a lot of money in lobbying. And so there's this whole sense that you needed to stop having government help people, and everybody had to do it by themselves. And so the whole idea of healthcare helping people fell victim to this notion, this ideological notion that we should get rid of government helping anybody. And basically, they also tried to get rid of Social Security under George Bush. They wanted to get rid of Medicare. They wanted to get rid of Medicaid. There was just this whole ideological fight going on in the United States. They loosened the laws on financial firms. They lowered the taxes on the rich. And then, as you may have heard, we had a huge financial crisis in 2008. And it was such an incredible crisis that an African American named, you cannot believe his name, Barack Hussein Obama won. Now, you have to understand, you had to have a huge crisis for a man called Barack Hussein Obama to win the presidency of the United States. But he did. And so when he won, not only did he win, but lots of Democrats won. And then he decided, well, I am going to get health care passed. And he had three big questions. Was he going to focus on health care or climate change? And there was a big issue at that time. And I think I came and gave a speech for Kiara, and I said, well, I think we're going to focus on climate change. I was wrong. It happens. So he decided to focus on health care. Now, when you decide as President of the United States that you're going to focus on a particular issue, you can't just decide as an individual, oh, I'm going to do this. You have to build a lot of political support. So a group called Atlantic Philanthropies would go into the communities, and they had hearings, and they had people describe how terrible it was not to have health care. They would greet congressmen at 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock in the morning when they were coming back, and they were so tired because they had just come back from Washington. And hundreds of people would be carrying signs and saying, you're wonderful, you're terrific, you're great, because you're fighting for health care. So all these congressmen thought, I'm going to keep fighting. They were trying to prop them up and make them feel good because they were fighting for health care. They also, remember I told you about the interest groups. They made deals with each of those interest groups. They made deals with the insurance companies and said, if you work with us, remember, we're going to make sure you're going to have 19 million more customers now. With the doctors, you're going to have more customers. With the medical devices, yes, we're going to tax you more, but you're going to get more money because you're going to have more customers. So there were lots of deals being made with all these interest groups. They were going to get more money because they were going to have more patients. Capiche? Money helps. That's one thing you're going to remember from my slides. So that's one thing they did. Then the second issue was, who was in charge? Remember when I said that Hillary Clinton tried to help? Tried? I just was wondering if you remember what I said 5 minutes ago. Okay. Her was a disaster because she had an idea and she put everything together by herself. That didn't work. What you do in politics, you have to work with people. You have to get them involved. You have to listen to them. You have to make sure that they feel that this is their idea rather than my idea. That's a secret, not much of a secret. In politics, you always have to make sure that it's the other person's idea, because then they feel, I want to make it win, right? Kind of obvious. So what Obama did is he said to Congress, you take charge, you figure out how to make it happen, you make it work. And so he got the Senate and the House to put together the legislation. And a lot of people criticized Obama because they said, what kind of leader are you that you're giving the power to Congress? And he was thinking, because if they think it's, if they think it's their power, if it's their doing, they'll make it work. And that's just what he did. It's not with me, it's the microphone. Okay. And then the issue was, should they work with Republicans? And at the beginning, oh, it's much clearer. Lucky you. Okay. And then the question is, should they work with the Republicans, the other party? And at the beginning, they said, yes, we should work with the Republicans. But you may remember that one of the Republicans said when Obama was elected, I am not going to let him win anything. I have one goal, which is to get him defeated and make him lose. But they still thought it was a good idea to work with Republicans. Then my uncle, Ted Kennedy, died. And so they lost their majority. They lost their filibuster. They've lost the ability to get everything passed. And so what happened is they had passed it in the Senate, and the issue was, after Ted Kennedy died, a number of people thought that was the end of health care. It's gone. It's finished. It will never be revived. It's the end of the dream. We had tried, but it had lost. And guess what happened? Nancy Pelosi is the hero of this story. She's of Italian heritage because she said, I am going to make it happen. And even though it's not the perfect bill, and even though it's going to be difficult, I'm going to say to my Congress, we're going to take the Senate bill. It's not perfect. My members won't be happy, but it's the only way to make it happen. And she got the Congress to take the Senate bill, and they passed it, and they won because of Nancy Pelosi. And she deserves a big round of applause, because if it hadn't been for Nancy Pelosi, we would not have 17 million more people today having health care. So can we give a round of applause to great Nancy Pelosi? She really is. She's totally the hero. It may not help you, but she is really fabulous. So they passed it, so we got it passed, right? But do you think the Republicans gave up? No. So they had different ways to keep fighting this. They thought, well, we'll just get it defeated in the Supreme Court. And they had three ways to do it. One, they said, is part of it, is the individual mandate constitutional? And in 2012, they asked that. And a great surprise, a Republican, it was a 5-4 decision. Justice Roberts, who was supposed to be a big Republican, voted with a majority. And he was very smart to do that, because it meant that that the Obamacare was constitutional, and it meant that people could say the Supreme Court is not overturning an important piece of legislation. Then there was a question about religious exceptions, and President Obama lost that, which you're probably not as interested in. I was interested in it. It had to do with contraception and the Pope and the Catholic Church. We won't discuss it here today. No. Okay. And then finally, just a few months ago, there was a question, can a typo, literally a typo, destroy the bill? And at one point, very interesting, the fact that the Supreme Court took this case meant that they were going to overturn the piece of legislation. But then it became clear that if the court overturned the legislation, all these Republicans would be blamed for many Americans losing their health care, which would be a disaster during an election year. So the Supreme Court reversed course and decided 6-3 that Obamacare would stay. Very interesting decision. And so it is now the rule of the land. So now you can question what has actually happened with health care. The results. Inflation is at a 50-year low. We're saving money. Remember how much we used to cost? We're now reducing the cost. Hospitals are saving billions without uncompensated costs. So hospitals are in good shape, better shape. Inflation is going down. 90% of Americans are covered, the largest number ever in American history. Patients with pre-existing conditions are also are now getting coverage if they want it. So there are very good outcomes. These are a few of the challenges that we've seen just recently. Oh, I don't know where this came from. The Republicans have still said 50 times they voted to repeal it. 50. The Republicans don't give up. They're going to lose, but they don't give up. Oh, these are the issues I wanted just to mention. There are a lot of issues, but I just thought I'd mention two of them. Because we now cover mental health costs, we have the fact of a lot of people now are dealing with the issue of mental health. 75% of the homeless have mental health issues. And one of the most incredible things that we've seen, I don't know if you had this issue in Italy, but for the first time ever in 2009, prescription drug overdoses have beat out car accidents as the #1 death. Because people are getting prescription drugs. It beats out deaths from cocaine and heroin deaths. And so there's this huge problem with prescription drugs because people now get prescription drugs and they're taking too many of them and they're dying. And so there's a huge challenge right now about how we deal with the question of prescription drug overdoses. And finally, my last slide is we now have a presidential campaign. Many of the Republicans are still saying Obamacare is terrible, but interestingly enough, two of the presidential candidates who are leading at the moment in the polls, or in part some of the polls, both Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side and Donald Trump on the Republican side, both say we need a single-payer system, which is very radical, and who knows if that will be the end, but that's how I'm going to end this. Thank you very much.